America has fought wars that cost $8 trillion and were paid for by no one. This is the story of the opposite, the war America fought almost for free. In 1991, the United States deployed nearly 700,000 troops, waged one of the most lopsided military campaigns in modern history, and won total victory in 100 hours. And when the bill arrived, around $61 billion, the American taxpayer paid only about $7 billion of it. Someone else covered the rest. This is the most heavily subsidized war in American history, and quite possibly the last one that ever paid for itself. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. But to understand the war, you have to understand why it started. And it started, like almost everything on this channel, over money and oil. In 1990, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein had a serious financial problem. He had just spent 8 brutal years fighting a war against neighboring Iran, a war that ended in 1988 with no real winner and left Iraq buried under a mountain of debt, something like $80 billion. And a huge chunk of that debt was owed to his own neighbors, the small, fabulously wealthy Gulf states, above all Kuwait. Saddam came out of that war broke, heavily armed, and deeply resentful, and he turned his eyes on the tiny country next door that he owed billions to. And Kuwait was making his problems worse in 2 specific ways, both about oil. First, Kuwait was pumping oil above the limits OPEC had agreed on, flooding the market and driving the global price of oil down. For a country like Iraq that lived entirely off its oil revenue, this was devastating. By some estimates, every $1 drop in the price of a barrel cost Iraq around $1 billion a year. Kuwait was, in effect, draining Saddam's treasury just by overproducing. Second, Saddam accused Kuwait of using slanted drilling to siphon oil out of a giant field that straddled their shared border, essentially stealing Iraqi crude. So from Saddam's point of view, here was a small, rich neighbor he owed a fortune to who was simultaneously crushing his oil income and stealing his oil. His solution was breathtakingly simple. On August 2, 1990, he invaded Kuwait, annexed it outright, and in one stroke erased his debts and seized one of the richest oil prizes on the planet. Hold on to that number, around $7 billion of net cost to America, because the way that bill got paid is one of the most remarkable financial stories in the history of warfare. Because the moment Saddam took Kuwait, alarm bells went off in every capital on earth, and not because the world was so devoted to Kuwaiti democracy. Kuwait was an oil-rich monarchy, not a shining republic. The panic was about something far more concrete, the global oil supply. Do the math that terrified Washington. Iraq and Kuwait together sat on roughly 20% of all the world's known oil reserves. And Saddam's tanks were now sitting right on the border of Saudi Arabia, home to the largest oil reserves on the planet. If he kept going and took the Saudi oil fields too, one single, hostile, unpredictable dictator would control something approaching 45% of the entire world's oil. He would have his hand on the throat of the global economy, able to set prices and choke supply at will. This was the real stake. As U.S. Secretary of State James Baker bluntly summarized why it mattered, the issue came down to jobs. The American and global economy ran on affordable oil, and Saddam was about to seize the tap. And you got an instant preview of what his control would mean. In the weeks after the invasion, as the world lost Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil to the crisis, the price of a barrel roughly doubled, leaping from around $21 to over $40. That price shock rippled through the global economy and helped tip the United States into a recession. And that was just from the disruption. Imagine Saddam permanently controlling half the world's supply. For the great industrial powers, this wasn't a distant moral question, it was a direct threat to their economic survival. Quick pause. This is exactly what this channel is built for, the money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now, how America turned a war into a group project that everyone else paid for. Because President George H.W. Bush did something genuinely masterful, and it had two parts. The first was diplomatic. He assembled an enormous international coalition, 35 nations, to confront Saddam, giving the operation global legitimacy and spreading the military load. But the second part was financial, and it's the part that makes this war unique. Bush didn't just build a coalition to fight, he passed around a collection plate to pay. His administration went to the wealthy nations of the world with a direct message: this war protects the oil supply that your economies depend on just as much as ours, so you are going to help pay for it. And astonishingly, they did. Look at who wrote the checks. Saudi Arabia, terrified of being Saddam's next target, contributed around $16 billion. Kuwait, the government in exile, desperate to get its country back, paid another $16 billion. The United Arab Emirates added about $4 billion. And then came the two most interesting contributors of all, Japan and Germany. Both were economic giants, but both had post-war constitutions that made sending combat troops politically impossible. So instead of soldiers, they sent money. Japan paid around $10 billion, Germany about $6.5 billion. They bought their way out of fighting and into the coalition with cash. Add it all up, and America's allies contributed roughly $54 billion toward a war that cost about $61 billion. The United States, the nation that supplied the overwhelming bulk of the troops, the aircraft, the ships, and did almost all the actual fighting, was left covering only about $7 billion of the direct cost. For perspective, that is a rounding error compared to what wars normally cost a great power. People later called it checkbook diplomacy, and it made Desert Storm the most heavily subsidized war in American history. And the war those checks paid for was shockingly one-sided. It began in the air on January 17, 1991, with a massive bombing campaign that pounded Iraqi forces for weeks. Then, on February 24th, the ground assault began, and it was over almost before it started. In just 100 hours of ground combat, the coalition shattered the Iraqi army and liberated Kuwait. A ceasefire was declared on February 28th. 100 hours. It was one of the most decisive victories in modern military history. And here's a second way the war paid for itself, one most people never think about. Desert Storm was the first war broadcast live, around the clock, on global television. And what the world watched was a dazzling showcase of American military technology. Precision-guided smart bombs flying through doorways, Patriot missiles intercepting incoming Scuds on live TV, stealth fighters, cruise missiles, night vision warfare. For the American defense industry, this was the greatest product demonstration in history. Every nation on Earth watched American weapons work with terrifying effect, and in the years that followed, foreign governments lined up to buy them, driving tens of billions of dollars in U.S. arms exports. The war wasn't just paid for by allies, it doubled as a live commercial that sold American weapons for a decade. But the bill didn't vanish. It landed on the man who started it. As Saddam's army retreated from Kuwait in defeat, it committed one final act of economic destruction. Iraqi forces set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields, torching somewhere around 600 to 700 oil wells. These fires burned out of control for months, consuming millions of barrels of oil a day and blackening the sky, an environmental and economic catastrophe that cost well over $1 billion just to extinguish. And in the years that followed, the international community made Saddam's Iraq pay for the destruction it had caused. Through a United Nations compensation program, tens of billions of dollars were siphoned directly out of Iraq's future oil revenue to pay reparations to Kuwait and others. It's one of the rare cases in history where the aggressor was actually forced to foot the bill for the war he launched. But there was one cost no reparations check ever covered, and it fell on the winners. Of the roughly 700,000 American troops deployed, an estimated 250,000 came home with a mysterious cluster of chronic ailments, fatigue, joint pain, memory problems, respiratory illness that became known as Gulf War illness. That's roughly 1 in 3 of everyone who served, carrying a lifetime of medical and disability costs that the tidy $61 billion price tag never captured. Even the war that paid for itself sent an invoice its own soldiers would keep paying for decades. So step back and look at the whole ledger, because it's almost unbelievable. America fought a massive war, deployed nearly 700,000 troops, won a total and rapid victory, sold billions in weapons off the back of it, watched its allies cover the overwhelming majority of the cost, and then watched the enemy get forced to pay reparations on top. On pure accounting, the Gulf War may be the closest thing to a genuinely profitable war any modern superpower has ever fought. It was, in cold financial terms, a triumph. And yet, this is where it gets complicated, and where two dark ironies close the story. The first is personal. President Bush won this spectacular war with public approval ratings approaching 90% numbers almost no president ever sees. He looked unbeatable. But remember that oil price shock and the recession it helped cause? The American economy was hurting, and by the 1992 election, voters had turned their attention from the triumph abroad to the pain in their wallets at home. The campaign that beat him ran on a simple phrase: "It's the economy." The man who won the most financially successful war in modern American history lost his own job, in large part because of the economy that same oil crisis had damaged. Winning the war couldn't save him from the economics of it. The second irony is far larger, and it connects this war directly to the last video on this channel. To fight the Gulf War, the United States had to station hundreds of thousands of troops in Saudi Arabia on the soil that contains Islam's holiest sites. To the Saudi government, this was protection. But to one wealthy Saudi exile, a man who had offered to defend the kingdom himself with his own fighters and been turned down in favor of the Americans, the presence of U.S. troops on that sacred ground was an unforgivable outrage. His name was Osama bin Laden, and that grievance became the seed of his war against the United States. The cheap, triumphant 100-hour war that cost America only $7 billion helped light the fuse on a very different war, one that would cost $8 trillion, last 20 years, and have no clean victory at all. The most profitable war in modern American history planted the seeds of the most expensive one. So here is the whole arc in one line. A bankrupt dictator seized his neighbor's oil to escape his debts. The world, terrified of losing control of the global oil supply, assembled a coalition and remarkably split the bill, leaving the superpower to fight a huge war for pocket change. It was a masterpiece of checkbook diplomacy, a live advertisement for American arms, and, on paper, a war that paid for itself. But cheap only ever counted the invoice on the desk. The true cost of the Gulf War wasn't the $7 billion America spent in 1991. It was the trillion-dollar reckoning that came a decade later and never showed up on any bill. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money. And the Gulf War is the one where America seemed to win that front completely, only to discover that the cheapest war it ever fought had a hidden price tag larger than almost any war it ever paid for. If you made it this far, you're exactly who war economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.